Good afternoon. Today we are going to discuss about regional conditions of upper limb. So here these are the different conditions which are going to be covered today under this chapter of regional conditions of upper limb. Most of these questions will be either asked as 4 marks question or 2 marks question to you. So let us go in detail about them. So first thing is periarthritis of shoulder. Mostly in and around your family, ladies or somebody above 40 to 50 years of age, usually they complain of pain of the shoulder and inability to move the shoulder. And usually those patients are diabetics. So in such cases, there are different options. You elicit history of trauma and then history of prolonged immobilization, etc., etc. And in such type of cases, you can, periarthritis of shoulder is one of the differential diagnoses. So now let us look into periarthritis of shoulder. So periarthritis of shoulder is also called as frozen shoulder or adhesive capsulitis. This is the disorder which is characterized by progressive pain. Initially there will be pain which is gradually progressing, and then after a period of time it subsides. And then it is characterized by stiffness of the shoulder. And both these symptoms, they usually resolve after about 18 months. So here coming to the pathology, there is active fibroblastic and myofibroblastic proliferation in the anterior capsule, of the shoulder joint and coracohumeral ligament of the shoulder joint. So in the shoulder joint, we have different glenohumeral ligaments in the anterior part of the capsule, superior, middle and inferior glenohumeral ligaments. There will be contraction, small contractures of these ligaments, which leads to the stiffness of the shoulder. Actually, the shoulder here, assume this to be the glenoid cavity, and this is the humerus. This glenoid cavity is not as convex as that of acetabulum, to which accommodates the femoral head. So here, for the stability of the shoulder joint, we have the capsule and different ligaments which provide stability to the shoulder joint, and they even restrict the abnormal mobility of the shoulder joint. That is the main physiological function of the capsule and different ligaments. However, they restrict the movement, but when they are contracted, they restrict the movement so much that the activities of daily living will become difficult. Even the normal range of motion also the patient will not be able to do. So that is the main pathology of the periarthritis of the shoulder. So in this we have two types: primary type, which is idiopathic type, and the secondary type, it is mostly associated with different conditions like diabetes mellitus, Dupuytren's disease, hypothyroidism or cardiac disease, and prolonged immobilization. So all these things, they lead to periarthritis of the shoulder. And coming to the clinical features, it mostly occurs in middle age, and there are three phases. There are three phases in the, sorry. So there are three phases in the disease of the periarthritis of the shoulder. So what are those phases? The first one is the pain. There will be severe pain of the affected shoulder. It starts insidiously and progresses gradually. And the pain will be usually worse at night, and it is exacerbated when the patient lies on the affected side. And as a result, gradually the patient, because of the pain, stops using the arm less, and he decreases the use of the arm, leading to the stiffness of the shoulder joint. Then in the phase 2, we have the stiffness, which usually lasts for 4 to 12 months. And during this phase, you have history of difficulty in activities of daily living, like the patient will be finding it difficult to comb the hair, combing hair, and then turning the arm backwards towards the back. All these things, they will be difficult in the phase of stiffness. And coming to the thawing phase, In thawing phase, there will be gradual resolution of the pain and stiffness, and it usually lasts between 6 months to 1 year. So here I'm pointing out with the cursor. You can see the graph. Here there is pain, which is initially insidious in onset, and it gradually progresses, and then it gradually decreases. And here comes the range of motion. Initially it is normal, but because of pain and the patient stops using the hand. Apart from that, the pathology also increases, and as a result the range of motion gradually decreases. Later it may improve, the range of motion may improve, but it is never the same as it was previously before the disease. So these are the clinical features of the periarthritis of the shoulder. So coming to the examination, the abduction of the shoulder joint. So abduction of the shoulder joint is restricted. Abduction and external rotation are restricted initially. Here in this image you can see, this is the diseased shoulder and this one is the affected shoulder. I am showing it with the cursor. See the range of abduction of the normal joint, that is the normal shoulder. And here the patient is unable to abduct the shoulder completely. Here one thing you have to understand, abduction for the initial 90 degrees, it is just the humeral head moving upwards in the glenoid cavity. That is the initial range of abduction. Later, gradually the scapula also moves against the thorax. The scapulothoracic movement contributes to the further range of abduction. Now, in this disease, initially here, there will be scapulothoracic movement. The patient will try to compensate for the loss of abduction at the glenohumeral joint by utilizing the scapulothoracic motion. So that is what which happens. So here there will be slight deviation of the scapula because the patient tries to use the scapulothoracic motion to raise the shoulder instead of lifting the hand by using glenohumeral motion. And then there will be global restriction. Initially, the abduction and external rotation are restricted. As the disease progresses, there will be global restriction. That is, all ranges of motion, abduction, adduction, internal rotation, external rotation, flexion, extension, all movements are restricted, both passive and active. Active movement is something which the patient does by himself. Passive movement, the examiner elicits the motion. He will move the arm like this. With the help of other hand, he will move. So that is the passive motion. So here the diagnosis is mostly clinical and there are no X-ray changes. However, we take X-ray to rule out some trauma. Probably a female of about 70 years of age, trivial fall, and because of the osteoporotic ones, there could be some one part or two part undisplaced fractures which are neglected, which are not seen. Even they may lead to the stiffness of the shoulder because the patient will not move the limb. So to rule out such fractures, X-rays are taken. So coming to the management. Initially, conservative management by using NSAIDs and then pendulum exercise. That is the range of motion exercises. The movement of shoulder, like pendulum of the clock, it is moved forward and backward, and gradually abduction is also introduced. Like that, exercises are done initially passively and then actively to achieve the range of motion. Sometimes intra-articular steroids are also given to relieve the pain. And if both these things they fail to achieve the desired results, then we go for closed manipulation under general anesthesia. Here the FEAR, it is the acronym for the movements which we do during the manipulation. That is flexion, initially flexion followed by extension and then abduction, adduction, and then rotations are also done. This is closed manipulation under anesthesia. This is followed by arthroscopic release. Arthroscopic release is done in other cases when all these treatments fail. So this is all about periarthritis of the shoulder. where there will be initial pain followed by stiffness of the joint. There will be restriction of the range of motion, particularly abduction and the external rotation. And later on, the patient is treated by using NSAIDs and pendulum exercises, which is the mainstay of treatment, followed by intra-articular steroids, and then surgical management, which includes close manipulation under anesthesia and arthroscopic release in resistant cases. This is all about periarthritis of shoulder. Usually it is asked as either 2 marks question or 4 marks questions. And then next we have the next condition, deltoid fibrosis. Deltoid fibrosis, there will be contracture of the deltoid muscle, and this results in the abduction deformity of the shoulder. Because deltoid helps in abduction of the shoulder, there will be abduction, and the muscle is contracted, there will be abduction deformity of the shoulder. Usually it is localized to the middle fibers of the deltoid. And some studies have shown associated between the intramuscular injections of tetracycline and quinine in childhood with deltoid fibrosis. There is association between these intramuscular injections and deltoid fibrosis. Coming to the clinical features, we have the abduction deformity. See, this is the affected shoulder, which I am showing with the cursor. There is abduction deformity here at the shoulder joint. And here you can see on the posterior aspect, there is prominence of the medial border of the scapula. And the adduction, the movement adduction is restricted because of the abduction deformity. Because of the contractures, there will be tight cord-like structure can be seen over the middle fibers of the deltoid. It is relieved surgically by releasing this contracture. The deformity can be corrected. So these are the two things, and then we are going to rotator cuff disorders. In rotator cuff muscles, we have the here in the second picture I am showing here supraspinatus muscle, and this is the infraspinatus and teres minor, and the subscapularis muscle anteriorly. All the 4 muscles, they constitute the rotator cuff muscle, and they help in different movements. They not only help in movement of the shoulder joint like rotations, as well as initial abduction of the shoulder joint. They also act as dynamic stabilizers of the shoulder joint. That is, the tone in these muscles, the tone in the supraspinatus muscle, it prevents. So here you can see the supraspinatus muscle. This is the supraspinatus, which I am showing with the cursor, and this supraspinatus, the tone in this muscle, it prevents the upward migration of the humerus during the abduction of the shoulder joint. It maintains the contact between the glenoid and the humeral head when the humerus gradually goes into abduction. This muscle, the tone in the supraspinatus, it prevents the superior migration of the humeral head. Please note it down. We'll see again how it helps. And this is the subacromial bursa, this one. And in this picture again you can see this is the acromion process, and this is the coracoid, and here we have the coracoacromial ligament. So all these 3, it forms the subacromial arch, and within this arch the shoulder joint, the humeral head, it rolls down and abduction of the shoulder takes place, and here we have the subacromial bursa. So now let us look into the rotator cuff disorders after this initial discussion. So rotator cuff disease is a spectrum. It is not a single entity, it is a spectrum. First thing in the spectrum is subacromial impingement, followed by partial tear of the rotator cuff muscles, and then there will be complete tear of the rotator cuff muscles, and then rotator cuff arthropathy. All these 4 things, they constitute the rotator cuff disease. So this I am telling you for your better understanding of the pathology. So here gradually when there is any overuse or any disorder, there will be degenerative tears in the supraspinatus tendon, or there can be supraspinatus tendinitis, which may lead to the gradual impingement, subacromial impingement, and that means in the subacromial region there will be impingement of the greater tuberosity during the movement of the shoulder. That will be the initial thing in the disease. So followed by that, there will be gradual attrition of the tendons leading to the partial tear, and then there will be complete tear of the tendon, rotator cuff tendons, and then it leads to the rotator cuff arthropathy. Now we are going to see it. So first we are going to see about the supraspinatus tendinitis, and it is usually seen in males of age 20 to 40 years. They usually complain of acute pain in the shoulder and inability to abduct the shoulder. There will be tenderness just below and lateral to the acromion and anterior to the greater tuberosity. And as I told earlier, there will be an arc of abduction of the shoulder. The range of motion of abduction between 60 degrees of abduction to 120 degrees of abduction is painful. And this painful arc of abduction is diagnostic of supraspinatus tendinitis. And here the X-rays are usually normal, but for some calcifications or degenerative calcification in the tendons. And treatment is usually by rest, NSAIDs, and conservative management is the stay of treatment. And coming to the rotator cuff tear, it can be either degenerative or traumatic. Degenerative tear because of overuse, it usually occurs in elderly people, and because of overuse of the tendon, there will be degenerative tears in the tendon. Traumatic events usually occur in younger population following some proximal humerus fractures or revulsion of the tendons, they occur. It can be either partial tear or a complete tear. So during the stages of rupture, initially there will be edema and hemorrhages among the fibers of the rotator cuff, followed by fibrosis, which is the healing process, and then there will be tendinitis. And then because of repeated use and inflammatory process, there will be bony spur, and then it gradually ends up in the tendon rupture. And coming to the clinical features, we have the pain and inability to abduct the shoulder. And there will be tenderness over the GT. In partial tears, the patient will be able to abduct the shoulder with some assistance. If we provide some assistance, the patient will be able to abduct the shoulder. However, in complete tears, the patient will be unable to initiate the abduction itself. So there is a small point here called abduction paradox. Deltoid also helps in the abduction of the shoulder joint. However, supraspinatus initiates the abduction. So once, in case of rotator cuff tear, once the arm is assisted or passively abducted to certain degrees, 90 degrees, then the patient can hold the abducted arm in that position using the deltoid muscles. Whereas, if the arm is brought below that range of motion, the arm drops suddenly down because of the tear in the rotator cuff muscles. This is the drop sign. So these are one of the clinical features of the rotator cuff tear. So once again, I want to repeat it. So deltoid, it also helps in the abduction. However, after certain degree of abduction. So once the initiation of abduction, which occurs because of the help of supraspinatus, once it is assisted by a person, or once the passively the arm is held in certain position of abduction, the patient can maintain that position because of the action of deltoid. However, once we bring it below certain range, the arm drops down suddenly because of the lack of action of supraspinatus. So that is the main thing in abduction paradox and drop sign. So now, I have already explained earlier that the supraspinatus muscle, it prevents the proximal migration of the humeral head. Suppose if there is a tear in the rotator cuff, there is supraspinatus tear, you can see in this X-ray, the X-ray which I am showing with the cursor. There is proximal migration of the humeral head and impingement onto the acromion, which leads to the sclerosis of the acromion process. This is called Sorsile sign. And there is also shearing force, that is the deltoid, it pulls off the humerus above, and there is no supraspinatus tendon to restrict its superior migration here. As a result, there will be some shearing force across the humeral head and the glenoid cavity, which leads to the arthritis, that is the arthropathy of the shoulder joint, because of the rotator cuff anomalies. This is called rotator cuff arthropathy, which is the end stage of the rotator cuff disease. So in such cases, X-ray is done to find out whether there is rotator cuff arthropathy or not. And then MRI is also used to localize the tears of the different rotator cuff tendons. And diagnostic arthroscopy is one of the modalities. Usually incomplete ruptures, they are treated by rest and analgesics. However, complete ruptures, they are treated surgically, and that is beyond the scope of discussion at your level. So we're not going in detail into the surgical management right now. So these are all the different disorders of shoulders, usually like periarthritis of shoulder, deltoid fibrosis, and rotator cuff disease. These may be asked as short marks questions, 2 marks or 4 marks in your exam. And then coming to the elbow, we have tennis elbow. Tennis elbow, it is one of the most common disorders. Most of the females, usually about 40 to 50 years of age, they complain over the pain and tenderness over the lateral epicondyle. It is also called lateral epicondylitis, lateral epicondyle of the humerus. It is non-specific inflammation of the extensor, origin of the extensor muscles of the forearm. And patient usually finds tenderness precisely located at the lateral condyle of the humerus. And whenever the extensor muscles are kept to stretch, there will be pain. The pain is aggravated. Tennis elbow is treated using analgesics, anti-inflammatory drugs, hot water fermentation, and and the pain gradually subsides. If the pain doesn't subside, a local injection at the of corticosteroids at the maximum point of tenderness can also help in relieving the pain. Tennis elbow is usually asked as a 2 marks question, and the same pathology over the medial epicondyle is called the golfer's elbow. So this is one of the tendinopathies. These are also called enthesopathies. That is, whenever at the point of insertion of ligaments or tendons, there will be inflammation. Those are called enthesopathies. These are most commonly seen in seronegative spondyloarthropathies, which were dealt earlier in your earlier classes. So then coming to the deformities of elbow, you have the cubitus valgus and cubitus varus. Before that, let us see what normal carrying angle is. Suppose when a line is drawn along the axis of the arm and axis of the forearm, there will be slight outward deviation of the forearm compared to the arm. So this outward deviation, this angle is called carrying angle. So initially, when you look at the elbow, you have the slight valgus. Physiologically, there will be valgus. I hope all of you are able to see this thing. So here you have the arm, and then you have the forearm. There will be slight valgus angulation. This is the valgus angulation of the elbow. Probably it's not that clear. So this is the carrying angle. Here you can see I'm showing it with the cursor. This is the axis along the arm, and then this is the angle along the axis along the forearm. So you can see that normally this forearm is slightly deviated outwards from the body. So this is called the carrying angle. This carrying angle, while we are walking to carry off the pelvis, you need some outward deviation of the forearm. So that is the normal purpose of the carrying angle. It is usually less in males and more in females because of the wider pelvis. Females have wider pelvis, so the carrying angle is also more so that during normal gait, the forearm can carry off the pelvis. So this is it is around 10 degrees in males and 15 degrees like that in the females. That is the normal range. However, when this carrying angle increases, when there is increased outward deviation of the forearm, this is called cubitus valgus. And now when the forearm is deviated medially towards the body, it is called cubitus varus. Now let us see different conditions leading to cubitus valgus and varus. So cubitus valgus, here you can see that the elbow is outward, there is outward deviation of the forearm at the elbow joint, and there is exaggeration of the normal carrying angle at the elbow. So different causes of this cubitus valgus is decreased growth on the lateral side of the elbow, that is non-union of the lateral condyle of humerus or restriction of the lateral condyle of the humerus. They lead to the cubitus valgus deformities. So in such conditions, you have seen here that the medial epicondyle is more prominent. So here you can see some non-union of the lateral condyle of the humerus, which led to the cubitus valgus deformity. So as the medial condyle becomes more and more prominent, the ulnar nerve, which is located over the medial condyle, gets gradually stretched. Along with that, with the movements of flexion and extension of the hand also, there will be irritation of the ulnar nerve, and this gradual damage to the ulnar nerve, which progresses over years, leads to the tardy ulnar nerve palsy. That is, you will be having gradual onset of weakness and sensory disturbances along the distribution of ulnar nerve. Thus, that is the weakness and paresthesias along the medial two fingers, and along with that clawing of the fingers, all these things, wasting of the muscles, all these can be seen. Usually it takes many years for the tardy ulnar nerve palsy to appear, clinical features to appear in cubitus valgus. So in order to prevent such complications, this should be addressed. So here, by transposing the ulnar nerve anteriorly, so that you can prevent the irritation of the ulnar nerve, and if at all there is any gross deformity, they can be corrected by different osteotomies, like correcting osteotomies can be done here, which I will explain after explaining the cubitus varus. So here, this is the cubitus varus deformity. That is the inward deviation of the forearm at elbow. It is also called gun stock deformity because it looks like in a rifle you have the gun stock, so it resembles the shape of it. So it is also called gun stock deformity. And the most common cause of cubitus varus is malunited supracondylar fracture. See, cubitus valgus is a physiological thing. So even though it is slightly exaggerated, it does not cause any cosmetic abnormality to the patient, mostly. However, valgus is not physiological, and it will be, as a result, more disfiguring than the cubitus valgus deformity. So here, if you observe the cubitus valgus deformity, it is treated by lateral closing wedge osteotomy. Whenever we are previously in last year we have discussed about osteotomies. You have closed wedge osteotomy and open wedge osteotomy, two types of osteotomy. In open wedge osteotomy, see, this is the lateral open wedge osteotomy. That is, a wedge of opening is made in the bone, and a piece of bone is inserted. In cubitus valgus deformity, just imagine on lateral aspect of the humerus, an osteotomy is done, and a chunk of bone is placed. As a result, the deformity will come to the neutral. So this is the open wedge osteotomy, which is done in cubitus valgus, where a piece of bone is kept in the osteotomy site. Whereas in closed wedge osteotomy, see here we have created a wedge. Imagine a wedge is created here and bone is removed, and then gradually the distal fragment is rotated here, rotated, and it is fixed. As a result, this abnormality will be corrected. This is the closing wedge osteotomy. A wedge of bone is removed over the lateral aspect, and then this distal fragment is gradually brought up like this. So here a piece of bone is removed. and then gradually this distal fragment is rotated here and it is fixed. It is fixed. As a result, this varus deformity will be corrected. So I hope I am clear with cubitus varus and valgus, and further this will be dealt in clinical classes. And then now let us proceed to the hand and wrist conditions. So ganglion, it can be asked as a 2 marks question. It is a cystic swelling usually on the dorsal aspect of the wrist, and it arises from the leakage of synovial fluid from a joint or tendon sheath, and it contains clary viscous fluid. So coming to the clinical features, it is a well-defined cystic non-tender lump which can be transilluminated sometimes, and it does not move along with the tendons. Usually investigations, ultrasound is sufficient, and sometimes MRI is also done. Here, though dorsal side is more common in the picture, this is a volar ganglion. If it is small and asymptomatic, it can be left like that. Otherwise, we can aspirate the contents of the ganglion and intralesional steroid can be given. If it is impinging on the neurovascular structures or if it is causing any cosmetic problems, then it can be treated by surgical excision. Ganglion is frequently asked as a 2 marks question. And then coming to the next condition, which is de Quervain's tenosynovitis. This is a overuse disorder. Here in the picture you can see these are the tendons of abductor pollicis longus and extensor pollicis brevis. Both of them are going through small synovial sheath, tendon sheaths. These are the synovial sheaths around the tendons. Through these tendons are traveling and then they are inserting on the place of insertion. So here, as a result, because of their overuse, there will be constrictions. Imagine this is the tendon sheath and this is the tendon. Usually, whenever there is contraction and contraction of the tendon gradually glides to these tendon sheaths. Please listen to this concept carefully because the following concepts which we are going to see is about tenosynovitis, constricting tenosynovitis. Here, you have the gradually because of the overuse and inflammation in these tendon sheaths, this gets constricted. As a result, the movement of the tendon becomes difficult and there will be diffuse pain because of the inflammation along the radial aspect of the wrist. Radial aspect of the wrist, you have pain, and tenderness along the radial styloid process, you will have tenderness. And here, you will ask the patient to fold the fist with thumb inside like this. Fold the fist with thumb inside, and then you will ulnar deviate. Deviate the hand towards the ulnar side. With this, there will be excruciating pain and tenderness over the tendons, that is the extensor pollicis brevis and abductor pollicis longus, which is called Finkelstein test, which is diagnostic of the de Quervain's tenosynovitis. And with extension of the thumb against resistance also, you will have pain. This is called hitchhiker sign. So these are all different signs of the de Quervain's tenosynovitis. So before we go further, the movements of the thumb, you have the extension, flexion, which occur in the plane of the arm. Just to make it easy to you, I am just telling the movements of the thumb. You may be familiar with it. Abduction occurs perpendicular to the plane of the arm, like this. This is abduction. And trying to pinch something between the hand. This is the abduction of the thumb. This is the abduction. This is the adduction, and this is the abduction, and this is extension. This is flexion. This is opposition. These are all the different movements of the thumb. And so once again coming back to, and now another small point which I want to tell, that is the dorsum of the wrist. It is divided into different compartments. The extensor tendons, they go from the forearm and they insert over the various places of the hand. So this extensor aspect of the forearm, it is divided into 6 compartments. So now dequervant stenosynovitis pathology occurs in the first compartment, first extensor compartment. So please make a note of it. In the first extensor compartment, you have the extensor pollicis brevis and abductor pollicis longus. In the second compartment, you have the extensor carpi radialis brevis and longus. In the third compartment, you have the extensor pollicis longus. In the fourth compartment, you have the extensor digitorum communis and extensor indicis proprius. In the fifth compartment, you have the extensor digiti minimi, and in the sixth compartment, you have the extensor carpi ulnaris. So most commonly, this tenosing tenovaginitis, that is constricting type of pathology, is most commonly seen in the first compartment as well as the sixth compartment. So in first compartment, as we have seen in this compartment, these two tendons pass through. Sometimes there will be abnormal anomalous anatomical relationships. That is, even in this compartment there can be septations or another accessory tendons may also be present. So these things should be kept in mind while treating dequervant stenosynovitis. Now once again, coming to the clinical features, we have diffuse pain along the lateral aspect of the distal end of the radius. Diffuse pain along the lateral aspect of distal end of radius. And then you have the Finkelstein test positive. That is ulnar deviation. Remember it as ulnar deviation. Ulnar deviation of the wrist with thumb flexed and kept inside. There will be pain. And there will be pain on resisted extension of the thumb. There will be pain. So these are all the different clinical features. So coming to the treatment. So initially splinting. Here in the picture you can see the splint which is used here, and NSAIDs and anti-inflammatory drugs are also given. And now if there is no relief of symptoms, then intralesional steroid, it is given along the first compartment, first extensor compartment, which contains the two tendons which I have mentioned, extensor pollicis brevis and abductor pollicis longus. So even with these things, if the pain does not subside, then there will be surgical release of the tendon sheaths to release the tendons, to relieve the pressure over the tendons. So this is all about dequervant tenosynovitis. And then next you have the trigger finger. Trigger finger, just like that, previously when I told these tendons, here in the picture you can see. I am showing it with the cursor. Here you can see these are the long flexors of the fingers. And these are the different pulleys. In the hand, you have flexor aspect of the forearm of the hand. You have different pulleys. This is the annular pulley and these are the cruciate pulleys. Please remember these 2 points. I think further details are beyond your scope. So just remember that there will be annular pulleys and cruciate pulleys here. These are numbered A1, A2, A3 like that. And this is the A1 pulley, which is at the MCP joint. And through this pulley, whenever the tendons, whenever the hand moves from the flexion to extension, gradually these tendons, they glide through these pulleys. These pulleys, their actual function is to regulate the force for the fine prehensile functions of the hand. So they regulate the force of these tendons so that fine action can be maintained. So when we are extending the fingers from complete flexion, these tendons, they pass through the pulleys. So that is the main physiology which is happening. And coming to the trigger finger, gradually there will be obstruction of the free movement of the tendon through this A1 pulley. because of the inflammation and nodule formation on the tendon. This will not move easily through this pulley. This condition, it is commonly seen in ring and middle finger. And there will be tenosynovitis of the flex. There will be tenosynovitis of the flexor tendon sheath, and as a result, it will not be able to pass through the pulley. So here, the chief complaint is the patient will complain first pain and tenderness over the MCP joints. Here in the MCP joints, the patient will complain of the pain in metacarpophalangeal joint, and the patient will find it difficult to extend the finger following full flexion. First there will be pain, and then gradually at some point the patient will have catching, and suddenly the finger gives away like this. Observe my ring finger. Gradually there will be giving away. There will be a sudden snap. This is the grade 2. And then grade 3, there will be locking of digit in mid flexion. Then somebody has to passively correct it. That will be in further grade 3. And then in grade 4, the digit is fixed and locked like this. So these are all the different clinical spectrum of the disease. So there will be nodule in the tendon sheath, and we can palpate it, and the triggering also is more obvious in such cases. So initially for the treatment, NSAIDs are given, and local steroid injection at the pulley to subside the inflammation, it is given. Suppose if it is not cured, then the tendon sheath is released and the A1 pulley is also released, so that there will be free movement of the tendon. So the same pathology, if it occurs in the thumb, flexor pulsus longus tendon, this leads to the trigger thumb. There will be congenital constriction of the FPL tendon sheath at the level of MCP joint. It may occur bilaterally, and a small nodule can also be felt. And the surgical treatment is by division of the tendon sheath. So next we have Dupuytren's contracture. So in Dupuytren's contracture, there will be contracture of the palmar fascia of the ring and little fingers commonly. This pathology was first described by Dupuytren's and more commonly seen in Western countries. The exact etiology is not known, and it is more common in people suffering with diabetes, liver disease, and epilepsy. Here you can see this contracture, and cords are formed like this, and there will be contracture of the fingers. So coming to the pathology, there will be fibroplastic proliferation in the palmar fascia and other tissues superficial to it. So as a result, there will be contraction of the affected slips. So in late stages, even the skin may also get adhered. So this is a Houston tabletop test, one of the clinical signs. When a hand is placed flat on the table, you can see the flexion deformity at the proximal interphalangeal joint. This is because of the contractures. There will be flexion deformity, which can be apparent on Houston's tabletop test. It's commonly seen in males over 40 years of age, and patient usually presents with flexion deformity at the MCP joint. In initial stages, there will be hard nodule felt at the deep palmar fascia at the level of MCP joint. In later stages, there will be fibrotic band, which can be palpated as a cord-like thickening, and then the deformity becomes fixed. This is also associated with other diseases like Lederhaus disease, that is the fibrosis of the plantar fascia, Peyronie's disease, and Garrett's disease. And then the treatment is, in early stages, the subcutaneous fasciotomy is done to relieve the contractures. Whereas in extensive advanced stages, probably surgical excision of the entire thickened fascia is done. And then coming to the next important pathology, which is the carpal tunnel syndrome. It is the compression neuropathy of the median nerve at the wrist joint. So here, this is the carpal tunnel, and this is bound by the carpal bones. Scaphoid and trapezium on the radial side, and pisiform and hamate on the medial side, ulnar side. These are found. These are the boundaries, medially and laterally. And here superficially you have the flexor retinaculum and transverse carpal ligament. And coming to the contents of the carpal tunnel, we have the tendons of the long finger flexors, that is tendons of the flexor digitorum superficialis and tendons of the flexor digitorum profundus in their synovial sheaths. So these are the contents, and along that we have the flexor pollicis longus tendon. So totally there are 9 tendons and 1 nerve, median nerve. These are the contents of the carpal tunnel. So any decrease in the space of the carpal tunnel, which causes pressure over the median nerve, leads to the carpal tunnel syndrome. So what are the different conditions? Conditions in which the space is decreased, that is even extra growths in the carpal tunnel, all these things, any space occupying lesion or any injuries, all these things, they may lead to the carpal tunnel syndrome. Suppose in cases of rheumatoid arthritis like this, there will be extensive synovial hypertrophy and the space is filled up, median nerve is compressed, leading to the compression neuropathy. Sometimes there will be malunited colles or any fractures of the carpal bones or lunate dislocations and other things which compromise the space in the carpal tunnel, leading to the compression of the median nerve. Or there could be some neoplasia or tumors in the this region, leading to compression. These are all the different conditions which compress the nerve, which elevate the pressure in the carpal tunnel and which compress the nerve. So coming to the different etiology, you have rheumatoid arthritis, inflammation of the flexor tendon sheaths, compound palmar ganglion, which you were taught earlier, tubercular tenosynovitis of the radial bursa, or dislocation of the lunate bone into the tunnel, malunited colles fractures, myxedema, amyloidosis, diabetes mellitus, all these things, they contribute to the carpal tunnel syndrome. And some of the studies also show that people who use tools with excessive vibration are also susceptible to carpal tunnel syndrome. So coming to the clinical features, whenever any nerve is involved, there will be different sensory and motor symptoms like pain, paresthesia and numbness over the distribution of the nerve. And then there will be weakness of the thenar and muscles and wasting of the thenar muscles here. There will this numbness and tingling, it will be worse at night. And in lateral stages, there will be wasting of the thenar muscles, as we can see in this picture. So these are all the different clinical features. The patient initially presents with paresthesia, tingling and numbness in the lateral 3.5 fingers. And coming to the different clinical tests, whenever the wrist is held in excessive flexion, there will be compression of the median nerve. The pressure in the carpal tunnel will be increased, and as a result, there will be compression of the median nerve. One is Phalen's test. In Phalen's test, there will be increased flexion of the forearm. Here you can ask the patient to hold his hands like this. So the patient will not be able to hold his hands in this position because the symptoms will be produced. And then Tinel's test. It is when the examiner gently taps in the carpal tunnel, there will be the tingling sensation. And then coming to the Durkan's test, directly pressure is kept in the carpal tunnel. So which reproduces the symptoms. That is the Durkan test. I am trying to demonstrate the test. So this is Durkan's test and this is Phalen's test. And Tinel's you will percuss in the region. So coming to the treatment, the main treatment is to decompress the nerve. So initially to relieve the inflammation, and if there is any synovial inflammation, it can be treated with NSAIDs and steroid injection. And then the specific cause of the carpal tunnel syndrome should be addressed. The diabetes should be controlled and other endocrinal disorders should also be addressed. And then in severe cases, there will be surgical division. Usually, the incision is given along the lateral border of the third finger in this area, along this line. In this region, incision is given, and then the flexor retinaculum and transverse carpal ligaments are released or divided, and then the nerve is exposed, and surrounding any pathology, if there are any neoplasia or any tumors, they are removed, and the histopathology specimen, everything is taken. So the main goal is to decompress the median nerve so that it is freely mobile. You can test it. So these are all the different modalities of treatment for carpal tunnel syndrome. And then now we are going into different tendon injuries. Let us look into it fast. One is mallet finger. So mallet finger is the injury to the extensor tendon on the terminal phalanx. The extensor tendon to the fingers, it inserts onto the terminal phalanx, and whenever there is forcible hyperflexion, as shown in this picture, you can see that there will be avulsion of the tendon. One thing, the tendon by itself, it can get degenerated and get torn. It can be an intrasubstance tear, or sometimes it can be avulsed with a chip of bone of the distal phalanx. So this is the main pathology, main mechanism of injury. So as a result, when the extensor tendon is lost, the distal interphalangeal joint is held in flexion. The patient cannot straighten the distal interphalangeal joint. So the finger will be held like this, mallet finger. But because the joint is normal, passive movement will be there. Actively the patient cannot move as the tendon is cut. So there is a small classification of the mallet finger. In the first type 1 mallet finger, it is a closed injury with or without a small avulsion fracture. And in type 2 and type 3, you have open laceration. Open lacerations over the dorsum of the fingers, which lead to the tear of the tendon. And then in type 4, you have mallet fractures. That is, the fracture involves the intra-articular region of the distal interphalangeal joint. A large chunk of bone is there with involvement of this articular cartilage. So this is the Doyle's classification. Usually it can be treated conservatively using different types of splints. This is the stack splint, and this is the perforated thermoplastic splint, and this is the aluminum foam splint. So these are the conservative management. Initially for 6 to 8 weeks, it is on 24 hours, and then later for 4 to 6 weeks, only nighttime splint is used. And then gradually the range of motion exercises are initiated. Coming to the operative treatment, whenever there is intra-articular fracture or joint subluxation at the distal interphalangeal joint, it is treated surgically. Otherwise, for undisplaced fracture, it is treated conservatively using splints. So this is all about mallet fracture, mallet finger. Then there is jersey finger. All these things can be asked as 2 marks questions, only 2 marks questions. And then coming to the jersey finger, it is the injury to the insertion of flexor digitorum profundus over the distal phalanx. So it is seen in sports like rugby and football. It is more commonly seen in ring finger. The mechanism of injury is forcible hyperextension of the distal interphalangeal joint when FDP is maximally contracted. So here there will be pain and tenderness over the volar aspect of the finger, and the finger compared to the other fingers, the affected finger lies in slight extension compared to other fingers like this. And the patient will be unable to actively flex the distal interphalangeal joint. Remember, he can flex the finger because still the flexor digitorum superficialis is intact. Only flexor digitorum profundus tendon is avulsed. As a result, the patient will not be able to move the distal interphalangeal joint. So here you can see the avulsion fracture here. This is the C-arm image. You can see the avulsion of the fragment. And the treatment is rest, NSAIDs and splinting can be done. And if this chunk is large, they can be used surgically treated by using KVS. And then next coming to Skyer's thumb. It is the injury to the ulnar collateral ligament at the MCP joint of the thumb. So here at the metacarpophalangeal joint, there will be the ulnar collateral ligament. That is the joint capsule at the MCP joint. The medially it is called ulnar collateral ligament of the thumb joint, where whenever there is excessive valgus force applied to the thumb, excessive valgus force applied to the thumb in an extended and abducted thumb, whenever there is excess valgus force applied, that this tendon gets ruptured here. You can see here. The tendon gets ruptured, the ligament gets torn here because of the increased valgus force in abduction and extension of the thumb. So there will be pain and tenderness around the ulnar aspect of the thumb. The treatment is rest, splinting and NSAIDs. In complete tear, surgical repair of the ligament is done. This is all about Skyer's thumb. And coming to the infections of the wrist and hand. So the first one is the nail fold infection. It is also called paronychia. So here, this is the nail fold infection. These are the nail folds and the infection begins here. This is called paronychia. So this part, it is called epinoichium. Suppose sometimes complete these nail folds and even this part may also be involved. And then if neglected, this infection may also spread into the spread below the nail plate, forming the subungual abscess. And there will be pain, tenderness and swelling at the nail fold, and you can see the accumulation of pus in this picture. So here in these conditions, initially before the pus formation, the patient can be treated by using antibiotics and NSAIDs. However, after pus formation, incision and drainage should be done. Incision is given perpendicularly along the edge of the nail fold. Sometimes a part of the nail should also be removed for the decompression of the pus, for drainage of the pus. So this is all about the nail fold infection. So here the nail fold infection usually occurs whenever there is any breach between the nail plate and the nail fold. Usually girls who go for manicure or any pinprick injuries, all these things, they predispose us to the nail fold infections. So then there is Phelon or digital pulp space infection. It is also called Whitlow. Here the pulp, it is divided into multiple segments, multiple compartments by fibrous septa. So as a result, even a small amount of pus, if it gets collected there, it leads to excruciating pain. So there will be swelling and tenderness over the palmar aspect of the fingertip. So in severe cases, there will be necrosis of the skin over the fingertip if neglected. And sometimes if neglected, it may also lead to the osteomyelitis of the distal phalanx, and sometimes the tendon sheaths may also get affected, leading to the tenosynovitis, suppurative tenosynovitis. So all these things may complicate the Phelon. So initial drainage of the pus, surgically it should be done if the symptoms are not relieved by conservative management. So these are all the different incisions which are used to drain the pus in case of Phelon. And whenever, please remember one thing, these creases should never be breached perpendicularly. If I give a longitudinal incision like this perpendicularly, there is risk of formation of contractures here. So whenever we reach skin creases or joints, a zigzag incision should be given. And then coming to the next condition, we have suppurative tenosynovitis. The tendon sheath is a closed compartment extending from the distal palmar crease to the DIP joint, mostly for these three fingers. The index, middle and ring fingers, the tendon sheath, it is a compartment extending from the distal palmar crease to the DIP joint. Whereas in the thumb and little finger, these sheaths are coextensive into the radial bursa and ulnar bursa. I will show it in the picture. And these radial and ulnar bursae, they envelop the flexor tendons. And these bursae, they communicate into the forearm space of Parona. So any suppurative tenosynovitis, if it is neglected, the infection can pass on proximally. Here you can see these are the flexor tendon sheaths of index, middle and ring fingers. They are extending from the distal flexor, distal crease to the DIP joint here, distal palmar crease too. Whereas here you have the communication with the ulnar bursa and the radial bursa. Both of them are interconnected and both of them are connected to the space of corona, which lies between the pronator quadratus and flexor digitorum profundus. So whenever there is any inflammation or any pus formation, it will form a horseshoe shaped abscess. This is horseshoe shaped abscess is formed. So coming to the clinical signs, there will be tenderness along the flexor tendon sheath and the finger is kept in semi-flexed position of the involved finger. Any passive extension of the finger leads to the stretching of the tendon. As a result, there will be pain. And there will be diffuse fusiform swelling of the fingers. These are the Cannavale's 4 cardinal signs seen in flexor tenosynovitis. So there will be pain, swelling, tenderness, and difficulty in moving the fingers. So if the treatment is delayed, it can lead to vascular occlusion and necrosis of the tendon sheath, damage of the entire tendon, deformities of the fingers, and proximal spread of the infection. So it is treated by giving antibiotics, rest, and splinting here and surgical drainage. Here you can see the splinting. This is the position of safe immobilization where wrist is held in slight extension and then the fingers are extended and thumb is abducted. Fingers are slightly flexed and thumb is abducted. This is the position of ease in which the hand should be immobilized. And coming to the web space infection. Web space is the small triangular spaces found in between the fingers. These are the web spaces. Usually the infection follows some pinprick injuries like that. And here you see the web space between the little finger and the ring finger is affected. As a result, the finger is slightly abducted. This is called V sign. This is also termed V sign. There will be separation between the two fingers because of accumulation of pus and pain. The swelling is more prominent on the dorsal aspect of the webs. So we have the pain, swelling and tenderness and fullness in the web space. And then coming to the infections of the palmar spaces, the two main spaces which are important to you are the mid-palmar space and the thenar space. These spaces, they lie between the flexor tendon, they lie beneath the flexor tendon sheaths. They lie beneath the flexor tendon sheaths and interosseous muscles. So this is the section where you can see the thenar space and the mid-palmar space. This is the mid-palmar septum. These are the flexor tendons. And then you have the interosseous and the metacarpals. So this is the mid-palmar space lies between the flexor tendons and the metacarpals and the interosseous here. And this is the thenar space. This thenar space, it lies between the flexor pollicis longus here and then adductor pollicis here. This is the thenar space and the mid-palmar space. So in mid-palmar space infections, the normal concavity of the hand is lost and there will be tenderness and induration over the palm. And there will be huge swelling of the hand, usually more prominent on the dorsal side, giving appearance of a frog hand. And in thenar space infections also, you can see this area is swollen and red. And the thumb is abducted because of the increased pressure and volume of the thenar space. Any motion of the thumb and index finger will be painful. So pain, swelling and deep palmar tenderness is seen in these infections. Swelling is more prominent on the dorsal aspects and fingers are held in flexion. So the line of treatment is admission of the patient, limb elevation and intravenous antibiotic should be given. And if not responding, the patient should be treated with incision and drainage. So this is a small picture depicting different lines of incision for incision and drainage. So this is for the pulp space infection. And then this is for the tendon sheath infection, web space infection, and the thenar space and mid palmar space infection. Here, this can be done for the nail fold infection. This is perpendicular to the edge of the nail fold. So these are all different incisions which are given for the drainage of the infections of the hand spaces. So thank you. If you have any queries, please mail your queries to the email ID given here. If you have any queries, please type in the chat box. So we are going to deal in detail about cubitus varus valgus in clinical cases, in clinical classes when we discuss about them. And most of these questions are either 2 marks questions or 4 marks questions. Usually they are asked as short notes. So these are all the different regional conditions of the upper limb. Thank you.